So I grew up everywhere but New York. How many New Yorkers are here in this room? Yeah, majority? Or nearby, or New Jersey? So my short answer is I grew up everywhere but New York. I lived in Indianapolis, Kansas City, Rochester, New York, which all New Yorkers know is not New York, Vancouver, Canada. And then I came to Israel for my year in Israel, and I stayed. And I went to Bar Ilan University. And my last year, I met my husband, Josh, and we moved here to start our married life, which was very, very special. To start in a community, a very special community, to start in a place of Torah, to start in a place with amazing role models like Rav Aaron Lichtenstein and Rav Amital, who this building is named after. And Rav Lichtenstein actually gave Yakir his name in the Mivoah at his bris. And Rav Amital was the sandak at Yakir's bris. Little did we know, almost 27 years later, Yakir would be killed in another war. So you really are, you're in Israel, or you're Shana Bet in Israel, you're really living history again. When I made Aliyah, I knew if I had a son, he'd have to go to the army. But we never thought there would be another war like this war. I remember Yakir's tekes, his tekes kumta, where he was decorated as the best soldier, and there were hundreds of soldiers, hundreds of parents. And I remember to the part where they got to Ani Nishpa, which as a from soldier, you say something different. I shook my head and I said, no, not that. I don't want you to have to give up your life. But I knew that Yakir would have it no other way, that he knew the right thing to do always. And that even when he went to Aza, he went as a miluim. He was 26 years old. But the second time, university had already started. And I remember thinking, Yakir, you did enough. You did enough. It's time to go back to your life. It's time to go back to school. And Yakir said, there's no way I'm leaving my brothers. There's no way I'm not going to go back and be with them, even if I have an out. He didn't have to go back. But for him, he had to go back. He always had to do the right thing. Always. I just want to share a few. I could talk about Yakir for hours, days, for the rest of my life. And I hope I do and do him justice. But I just want to share a few things we can learn from him. He did so many things in his short 26 years of life, and very accomplished. He was a marathon runner. He ran half a marathon barefoot before he was killed in 2022, 23. And he won the marathon when he was 18 in his age category. And he was an artist, and he was a Talmid Chacham, and he was learning to be an architect, and he did so much. But what's most important to me, and what I think is the most important of his legacy, is what kind of person he was, and what there is to learn from him as a mensch, as a friend, as someone who always saw something that had to be done and then did it, but didn't just do it. He did it to the upteenth level and did it to the end. I just want to share a few stories with you. Most of them, almost all of them, I didn't know. His friends told me at the Shiva or afterwards, or still. I still hear stories from people about how Yakir affected his life. At the Shiva, one person called me from America and said, Yakir saved my life. And I said, how could that be? He didn't work in an ER. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't even volunteer for Madya. But I knew that Yakir saved this person's life, this boy's life. So I want to share a few things that I didn't know about. And I just thought, wow, I knew Yakir was a pretty special guy, but I didn't know that he had stories that were like Rav Aryeh Levine, that they could write a book about all the things he did that nobody knew. He didn't even tell anybody. One such story is after Purim, the first year after Yakir was killed. It's been 2 and almost a half years. And this organization calls me and they say, this year we want to do it, what we do in name of Yakir. I said, I'm sorry, I don't know who this is. What are you talking about? They said, you don't know that for the past 10 years, Yakir has been taking matanot le'evyonim to people around Yerushalayim for poor people who don't have food. He was bringing these big boxes. I have a picture of him that I'll receive later. He would go around every Purim, and I know Yakir as a driver. I'm sure he drove very, very fast, which is like the worst day in Yerushalayim to drive. And I said, no, I didn't know that. Since he had his license at age 16, every Purim, which is a crazy day at home too, Yakir would say, Yima, can I take the car? And I thought he was going to give shalach manas to friends. And most of his friends, I was friends with the mother. So I said, oh, take one for Clara, take one for Judy. He's like, no, Yima, it's enough, it's enough. You might need it if someone comes to the door. And, oi, Yima, you could sit here. So I said, no, I didn't know that, because Yakir would just disappear in the middle of Purim. And I never looked at my watch. I never paid attention to how long he was gone. And the reason why he didn't take shalach manas is because he was doing this mitzvah of matanot le'evyonim to people all over Yerushalayim. And for 10 years, I didn't know that. That's one such story. Nobody knew. It was mamash matan beseter. And another thing that I found out at Shiva, this is something I never knew as a concept, but apparently Moshe Feinstein has it somewhere in one of his farm, that there's a concept of ma'aser zman, where you give of your time. And Yakir worked very hard for money, and he liked to work hard, and he liked to make money even though he never used it, because he was always saving and for something. And people told me, Yakir thought, my time is much more important than, even though he really valued money in a good way. But he said, my time, he valued his time even more than money. That's what I'm trying to say. And he said, I'm not just going to give meiser. I'm going to set aside a time every day to do something, to help somebody else. Whether it was in the Beis Medrash to help a friend study or learn, or a personal problem. And he did this religiously every day. And I only know this because people told me afterwards. Yakir would set aside. I didn't know how many chavrutas he had. I kept meeting more and more. I still keep meeting more and more. This Rosh Hashanah, I was somewhere, and someone said, "Oh, my son was also a chavruta of Yakir." I said, like, he didn't even go to yeshiva with him. He didn't go to school with him. He sometimes went to the same shul. I said, how does he have time for all these chavrutas? And people sent me from all over, from South Africa, from London. People said, yeah, I learned with Yakir. I learned with Yakir. I learned with Yakir. But everyone I spoke to in the Beis Medrash said, we saw him learn with his regular chavrutas. I don't even know how he had time to do, but he made the time. And it wasn't just to learn. It was to do good, and it was to help people. I want to share a few stories about that in Aza as well. Before he went into Aza, he had a friend that lived near the base that he was on in Rehovot, and they called him up and they said, I'm really around the corner, like, tell me what you need as before you go into Aza. So Yakir gave them a whole list of things, and this person told me afterwards, I found out, because the chayalim that the things went to thanked me, because Yakir told them, this is from so-and-so, this is from so-and-so, and she said he didn't take one thing for himself. That whole list, nothing for himself. He didn't ask anything for himself. He just saw what this chayal needed. This chayal needed new boots, and this chayal needed that, and this chayal loved this candy, and this chayal he needed a journal because he wrote poetry. And that's the kind of person Yakir was. He was always, I know it sounds like, oh, come on, like, how can someone be, but really everything he did was to put the other person first, always. Even in Aza, when they captured the first building, very early on, in the first time he was in Aza, he said, we were at a building, which he was in Hadasa Kravit, and he blew up buildings. But first they had to make sure that it was booby trapped, and they went through and they took out he said every building, every single apartment, every institution, every building had weapons, RPGs and grenades and rifles and rockets and. And he said, out of the building comes a man with a white flag surrounded by women and children. And I said, what do you do? He said, well, we let all the women and children go. And I said to myself, well, that's so dangerous. And how do you know who's what and who has what? He said, no, we let all the women and children go. And then they had Modi'in with them, intelligence, to see who was who. And they captured this group of people. They knew that some of these terrorists were Nakbas that were involved in October 7th, who had raped and killed women and children in Israel. And they knew they were them. And so some of the soldiers were not, let's say, so polite in their treatment of these terrorists. And they tied their hands very, very tightly with the wrap ties, with those plastic ties. And some of the soldiers whose actual brothers, not just brothers in arms, their brothers and their best friends were killed. And they weren't pleasant with them. And Yakir went around and said, no, this is not how we act. This is not how we, even with our enemies, which he didn't say, but that's what he meant. This is not being enoshi. This is not being humane. This is not being a mensch. This is not being moral. And then Yakir went around and he untied all their hands and tied them kamoshet tzarich, how they were supposed to be tied. They tied them very, very tightly, and they were hurting them. And Yakir said, no, we have to do what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to do it. And that was Yakir, with the utmost morality, with the utmost humaneness. Another story, Yakir was killed with his chavruta, David Schwartz, who's buried here in Kfar Chatzion. I believe you're going to his kever after I finish speaking for the tzfira. And they weren't just chavrutas, they were very, very good friends. And they were very different in certain ways, but that complemented their learning, and they learned from each other. And I heard another story that when they were in Gaza, they were near a humanitarian area that they weren't supposed to go into. It's where the Palestinians were, and the soldiers weren't supposed to go in there. But Yakir and David, they saw from the corner of their eye, they saw an old woman on a stretcher, just lying there. And they instinctively, because this is who they both were, they just looked at each other and then they ran to go help her. For so many reasons, it wasn't what they were supposed to do, and it was dangerous. But they didn't even have to talk. And the soldier who told me the story, he said, I was right next to them and I saw. They didn't even talk about it. They knew what the right thing to do was. They always knew. So those are a few stories I want to share with you about Yakir being a mensch and always doing the right thing. In terms of being a friend and helping others. Also, before Yakir went into Gaza, I couldn't believe I saw that he posted while he's getting ready for war, and they're collecting all their gear, their tziyud, and all the emotional part that I can't even imagine what was running through their head. Yakir thought, I have an apartment that's just sitting there empty, and maybe one of the mifunim, one of the people who had to leave their home from the north or from the south, they could use my apartment. It's just sitting there. Chaval. So Yakir posted on his WhatsApp status, I have an empty apartment. Anybody who needs it, who's been expelled from their house, the key's hidden under my pot. This is my address. And I thought to myself, how is he thinking about other people in need when he's going into war, like the next day? And that was Yakir. That was another example of Yakir. I also met people that he went to school with, not just yeshiva, and he was an architecture student, which is very competitive, and they kick out half of the students after the first year, and some people have told me it's harder than medical school. And Yakir, not only was it competitive, but he spent nights working on projects all night. Sometimes a whole week would go by and he didn't sleep. And then he would come home and see he'd see ingredients in the fridge, even though he was coming to yeshiva to work in the kitchen and to be here for Shabbos many, many times. I remember he would come home and see all this stuff in the fridge, and I would go to sleep, and in the morning, Shabbos would be made for me. And I said, Yakir, you're not even home for Shabbos. He's like, it's okay, Emma. It was fun. But the story I want to tell you about when he was in architecture school was that people told me she said, I had messages. Look at all these messages I have. In the middle of the night, he was done with his project, but he saw that other people were struggling to finish theirs. And he wrote to people, I thought of a good idea. I have a way to so you might want to do this to make their projects better so that they would, that their work would be better because of his ideas. And it wasn't just one. People showed me, and they said nobody did this. In the entire university of the architecture school, not one person would help somebody else because they're all competing against each other. And Yakir could have just gone to bed, but no, he was thinking about other people and how to help them succeed. And Yakir, I'll tell you about some of the stickers. We have 4 stickers now, 2 of Yakir and 2 with David, which I have and I will give to all of you. The first sticker that we did, it says Eifo Achiyuch, and it's not something that Yakir went around saying, where's your smile, where's your smile? But when they were walking out of Sajaiya from the first time they were in Gaza, he was in for 5 weeks, first with Golani and Commando, and then when they walked out, he was with Sanchanim, and there were like 500 soldiers. They had no way to transport them out of Gaza safely. So they had to walk out, literally from the Mediterranean Sea. They had to walk the entire width to the border, and then another 3 kilometers, because they had no safe way to pick them up at the border. And they're walking out, and Sor Grossman, who was in Miluim, he went to a different yeshiva, but he told this story from his hospital bed because he was injured a few weeks before Yakir was killed, very seriously. And when he found out Yakir was killed, he said, there's no way I'm not going to Hexter's Levaya. He told the hospital in Tel Shomir, he said, I'm going with your help or without your help, but I'm going. And they took him in between surgeries in an ambulance from his hospital bed before the next surgery, with blaring sirens to Har Herzl. And he came in a wheelchair covered with blankets connected to an IV. And as soon as the funeral was over, he went back to Tel Shomir to have the next surgery. And he says from his hospital bed, first he said, I'm so sorry I can't be at the Shiva. He's injured in several ways. And he told a story about how they were walking out of Sajaiya and they couldn't lift their legs. He said, we'd been fighting for 5 weeks. We hadn't eaten and slept properly or at all, the sleeping part at least. And he said, we had to walk out. I don't even know how many hours it was. They were walking all night. He said, we couldn't lift our legs. And if I just told me recently, he said, Yakir had 90 kilos on his back. And, which just seems impossible, humanely impossible. But Yakir, of course, volunteered to take the pakalim, this heavy equipment. So he had not only his own stuff, but he took the equipment to make it, and it made it much heavier. Another thing he took, speaking of tzedakah, was one of the buildings that we were going to blow up. He found bags of money, not just bills, mostly not bills. It was all coins, bags and bags of coins. And he thought, what baltashkas? Like, why should we blow up this building with there's money here that could be used? So he schlepped it back to Israel, and then he went out with his friends to the shuk that week, and he gave it to poor people in the shuk. One friend of his told me he was with him in the shuk, and he gave him a bill that was ripped to this poor person, and the guy came running back. He said, "Zakarua, it's ripped," and Yakir said, "Okay, let me look for another one." And it was also so Yakir, again doing to the utmost, and. So the Eifo Chiyuch story, I was telling you about what was on his back, equipment and 90 kilo and tzedakah to give. And they're walking out and Sur says, we couldn't lift our leg. And then Yakir sees the sunrise coming up on the Israel side from the east. And he turns to his mifaked and he says, Ron, Eifo Chiyuch. And everyone around us who heard said, no one's thinking about smiling. Like, who's thinking about where your smile is? We can barely walk. And then Yakir started to run, and he ran all the way to the border, all the way back to Israel, to give all the soldiers around him the morale and pick up their spirits. And everybody who was there who told me, they said we couldn't believe what we were seeing. And that was also Yakir, always lifting people's spirits and making the best of everything, and then doing the impossible. And then another sticker we made, this is something he did say, is nisht pashut. He didn't speak Yiddish fluently, neither do I. But that also was so Yakir, because he managed to balance worlds. He was a yeshiva student, and he learned every day. Sometimes with more than one charuta a day. When one of his friends said, yeah, I remember he was in line with you guys at the airport. You guys were going away, and he took out a sefer and he learned in line. But he also knew how to have fun, and he knew how to live life. And it didn't matter what situation he was in, he could do both. Or if he was in one, he was in it all the way. If he was learning, it didn't matter if he was in line and been going with 400 people around him. Or if he was having fun, he had fun. If he was listening to somebody, he was a true friend who could really listen. It wasn't just listening, it was understanding while he was listening. I remember he used to say things to me, or say Dvar Torah at the table, or share something with me, and then he's like, Ima, did you understand? I said, yeah, Yakir, I understood. And then he said, no, Ima, did you really understand? He's like, can you tell me? Can you tell me back what you learned? And he wanted to make sure that people really learned from what they're supposed to learn from. And it wasn't just about him. It was when he listened to other people. He wanted to make sure that he really got it. I think from all these things, you can really learn so much about him. And I'm just sharing a few stories, but it's not just about Yakir. So many of our chayalim, they were worlds, and there's so many of them. But unfortunately, I have friends from before and now new friends, and I'm learning about their sons. And there's so much to learn about these tzaddikim. And it's not just because they were heroes, and it's not just because they gave their lives, which they did, al kiddush Hashem, which is huge to learn from, the selflessness. But they were personalities, and they stood for so much more than that too. So the message I want to leave with you is, you never know. I know it sounds cliche, the impact that you can have on people's lives, but I'm still hearing, it's almost 2.5 years later, I'm still hearing about people who said, Yakir changed my life. Yakir touched my life. Yakir turned my life around. And I'm thinking, he's 26 years old. There are 90-year-old men who didn't do what Yakir did in his lifetime. So I just want to leave with you these lessons about how you can always be more of a mensch. You can always look to do the right thing. You can always help a friend. You can always listen better. You can always do more. And it's not to say that what you do is not enough. I think that's one of, David, he wrote a sefer. He put together all his divrei Torah for every parsha. And he gave this to his wife before they were married, Meital. And every week, every Torah portion, every parsha is supposed to be relevant for that. But I feel like every time I read it, every week, it's almost as if he knows what we need to hear. He knows what lessons we need to be reminded of. It's like in Yonei Diyomo, he really, whatever's going on in politics that week, it's like he touches exactly what we need to hear. And I just want to share with you in closing what he said about Achrimu to come, and what he said about Tazria for last week. And he talks about this balance. So many times we can beat ourselves up and be like, oh, I'm not good enough. But that doesn't help you become who you can become and fill your potential. And I don't know if you know the famous there's a Hasidic sect called starts with an N. N. Yes, Nevarek. And thank you, Ima. And And the joke was there are two yeshiva bachers from Nevardik who their whole one of their tenets is, you're not good enough, you're not good enough, you're not good enough. And so one guy was saying, the joke. He says, "Ich bin gar nicht, ich bin gar nicht." And the guy, this friend turns to him and said, "You think you're nothing?" So it's not about that. It's about being inspired by these boys and men. And David talks about in אחרינו, he talks about this balance. And, people can go around and wear tchela, have long payas, and put be more machmir and more machmir. But the Baal Shem Tov, he says, warns about this because you don't want to, the Yetzer Hara can make you feel terrible about yourself. And then you just feel really like you're garnished and make you very sad. But he says that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says that he didn't distinguish between different kinds of mitzvahs, and you have to have a balance of your religious life and your communal life. And I think that is really the lesson that David and Yakir and so many of our chayalim left with us. And then last parsha, Tezriah Matzorah, David wrote, "Are we actually prepared to step forward into such a life of holiness and walk into a world with such an awesome atmosphere of harmony? What does it mean to rise up to an elevated spiritual life? And what does that require from us on a daily basis?" I think David's words ring true, and Yakir's do, and their actions speak louder than anything. And I just want to bless us all that we can be there more for each other and bring more harmony into our lives, into Am Yisrael's life. Thank you. Thank you for listening.